So even though we're back in Deluxe Paint 2e here, we need to look at that status bar at the side there, because it looks like we've got some fairly decent progress on it, but we really need to figure out some more specifics about it. Especially considering the fact that the shields, weapons, and power-ups have two different mechanics behind them. So I need to make sure that I've got it figured out how they're going to look with the different mechanics. In terms of the shields, I decided to completely ditch the diamond design, because I'm going to make it so that the shield power-ups still look like diamonds, but the diamond design in its own right just doesn't really define the shields that well. So instead, I came up with two different designs for the two different shield systems. For the charged shield systems, it's now going to be a sort of arrow graphic. And then as the number of arrows shown will be divided up based on what level of shields you have. So if you've got the basic shields, it'll be 3 segments, and if you got it fully upgraded, it's going to be 5 segments. And then as you take damage, the segments will dim. And if you have no segments in your shields left, then it'll turn red. For the energized shields, it's actually going to show a sort of hexagon in the middle that lights up to indicate that the shield's ready to take a hit. But if the shield's not ready to take a hit, then the different arrows at the sides will start to build up from the sides until they reach the center. And then when they reach the center will glow and the shields will go from red to cyan. Now, I was really unsatisfied with how I made the power-ups look originally, so I needed to come up with a new design for the power-ups. I decided to give them a sort of... I kept the shape, but I decided to make it so that the corners would be different from the sides and the middle. And I'd also have the sides be sort of a darker part of the same sort of color, whereas the corners would actually be just a sort of generic gray color. And I feel that this new look works out a lot better than the old look. In terms of actually showing the different power-up methods, the stacked power-up system is pretty basic. It just shows the power-ups stacked on top of each other, with the power-ups that aren't active being dimmed to gray, whereas the rechargeable power-ups will actually show like sort of segments. There's 24 segments in total, and as you destroy enemies, those segments will light up. And it'll actually light up at random, so it won't appear in a certain sequence or anything. And then once they're all lit, the power-up in the middle lights up to let you know that you can use it. It was at this point that I decided I didn't like the mission display. It was kind of a neat idea, but I wanted, given some of the changes I was doing with how the shields and the power-ups are going to look, I decided I wanted the mission thing to be a little more generic, so that it wouldn't clash so much. And I basically decided to just have one bar for the enemies to indicate roughly how many enemies are going to be left to face. And this gave me some more room to work with as well, so I decided to add a multiplier bar as well, so that players would know how close they were to raising their multiplier, since the multiplier raises based on the number of enemies defeated. Now at this point I realized I needed to come up with a look for the weapons. I decided to keep the box look. In fact, I always wanted the weapons to look like they were in a box. And it was kind of tricky at first. The first idea I came up with, it is really busy. This look definitely didn't work for it. But thankfully I came up with something much simpler that I felt worked a lot better, by having the colored triangular corners that were pointing outwards, and then just lines on the top and bottom to sort of separate it out and give it the box look. Now, I already pretty much had the combo weapons figured out in terms of how they would look, but I decided to change the plus symbols to arrows. And the reason why I decided to change them to arrows is so that players would recognize what direction the power-ups were being shifted in if they were picking one up when they already had a full set. So in this way, you would actually know which weapon was going to be lost in your combo if you picked up another weapon. But in terms of the leveled weapons, I had so many problems coming up with a good way of making the leveled weapons identified. I went through this whole idea of having these sort of stacked cursors. I went through this whole idea of having just bars for it that would increase in size, or have different numbers of bars based on how high the level could go. I had this thing going on where I actually had different banners, so to speak, that lined banners. Even that didn't work so well either, because how would you know what specific set of these lines would equal what level? I ultimately settled on something where the different levels of weapons would simply be represented by just generic looking little rounded rectangle things. But when that particular level wasn't reached, it would just be a dot. And the reason for this is because these sort of rectangular shapes would actually increase in size based on how high a level you were at. So they would get bigger the higher the level was. So you're actually getting two different ways of identifying a level in that sense. I know even this wasn't really the perfect way of doing it, but I had to come up with something. This was surprisingly hard to figure out. I was just sort of stunned, just how little was actually working for this. If I wanted to be really lazy about it, I could just show the weapon and then a level number, but what kind of fun is there in that? You want this to be interesting in some way, graphically interesting to the player. So it needs to look interesting, but still be functional at the same time. And that's the tough part whenever doing some kind of UI like this, is making sure that the player can identify what it is they're looking at without really knowing completely what it is they're looking at least in terms of this kind of thing.